Hello, you're welcome to Kema Freak. My name is Kemi Omorugbe. Thank you for stopping by. In this video, I'll be demystifying flares. So if you have ever wondered how flares are gotten, the waviness and all of that, just sit back because I promise you at the end of this video, you will gain clarification on everything you need to know about flares. Okay, so flares are circular attachment to dresses, sometimes to sleeve, sometimes to the waist, sometimes to the hem. You can make use of flares in diverse ways, and a circular flare will appear like this. You can see it is circular. So you have actually splitted here open because I'm assuming we're working with a waist. So we're working with a waist attachment as flare. So we'll be attaching this flare to the waist, and that means there'll be a zip allowance at the back, right? So in this video, we'll be talking about the different degrees of flare, the 180, 360, the 720, the 1440 degree flare. So you want to sit back and get this once and for all, because I promise you after this video, you won't have any issues understanding flares and creating flares. So come along with me. A flare will have two parts. We have this inner cycle and then the outer cycle, and that's what I marked out here. This is the inner circle and this is the outer circle. So the distance between the center and this inner circle, that's from here to here, that's what's termed the radius, and that's what determines the part you will need to cut out to accommodate the width of your waist or the circumference of the waist. We have already said we are assuming we're working with waist, so it could be any circumference you want to attach a flare to. So if you don't want to bother yourself so much about the formula or how this was achieved, maybe you just want this to stick to your head. So for a 360 degree flare, you are going to calculate that radius, that's the distance between here and the inner circumference of the cycle. You're going to get that distance r, which is termed r. So r, which is the radius, will be equal to the waist circumference divided by 6.28, and that's it. Okay, so for a 180 degree flare, the formula you'll be using to get your radius, which is r, is the waist circumference divided by 3.14. Okay, so that way you still get the same length as you will have gotten with the 360 degree flare, just that the degree of fullness will be different. So that's what makes each of those flares different. Okay, so I just wanted to set this out first so you understand if you don't want to bother yourself so much about the formula. Okay, but now I'm going to be telling you how this formula was achieved, and then we'll proceed to the working table where we'll practically cut out papers with the same waist circumference. We'll be cutting different degrees of flares so that you can see what I mean when I say the fullness increases or decreases. So I'll be cutting this out on paper. We're cutting different degrees of flare out on paper. But before then, let me quickly explain how this formula was gotten. Perhaps you're a teacher, you want to be able to teach your student the basis of these things. You don't just want to project things to them and expect them to accept it, because they're going to be asking you why, how. So I need you to get this properly. But if you don't want to be bothered about this, please skip this part of it, because I know many people don't like mathematical jargons, so you can skip this part. Okay, so how exactly did we come about this formula? So once again, here is the flare, the inner circle and the outer circle. No, this is not a flare. Okay, it just looks so distorted. So, okay, more like it. Okay, so the inner circle, now we need to find the distance between here and here. See where this arrow is? That's the radius we are looking at, because that's the part we'll cut out to get this width. That's the waist circumference in this case. We'll be starting with a mathematical formula, which is the formula for the circumference of a circle. So I'll just say the circumference of a circle. So the formula is circumference of a circle is equal to 2 pi r. Okay, so pi is a mathematical constant, which is 3.14 or 22 divided by 7. 3.14. So what we don't know now is this radius, which is here. We know the circumference because we know the waist circumference. So just take your tape and measure around wherever you're attaching the flare. That is the circumference. And here I said we'll be making use of the waist. So we're making use of the waist circumference. So we know the waist circumference already. We know the number 2, right? And then we know pi now, which is a mathematical constant, 3.14. What we don't know is this radius. So what we'll need to do here is to make the radius the subject of the formula. So I'll just say the circumference is the waist circumference is 2 pi r, right? So we want to make r the subject of the formula. And how do we do that? We'll divide the both side by 2 pi so that we can rule out this 2 pi. So waist circumference divided by 2 pi, and then here we have 2 pi r divided by 2 pi. So we are doing the same thing to both sides of the equation. So this 2 pi will rule out, divided by 2 pi, not 2 pi r. So this 2 pi will rule out the 2 pi we have here, and that leaves us with r, right? So that means r is equal to the waist circumference divided by 2 pi. And I already said it that pi here is 3.14, right? So waist circumference divided by 2 times 3.14 will give us the radius we are looking for. So now that means the radius of a full circle flare is waist circumference divided by 6.28. So now you see how we arrived at that initial formula. So that's why I said when you want to cut a circular flare, to achieve the radius, you divide the waist circumference by 6.28. So if it's a 180-degree flare, which is half of a circle, that's the angle on a straight line, you're going to be dividing the waist circumference by half of this. So it will be the waist circumference divided by the radius for a half circle flare will be the waist circumference divided by 3.14. So I hope you understand this. But right now we'll be going to the working table and I'll be cutting out the different degrees of flare. So you will see how you will achieve the same waist circumference but then different degree of fullness. So the more the degree of fullness, the more waviness you have on your flare. So we'll be working with a waist circumference of 20 inches and the length of flare we want to create is 5 inches. So it doesn't matter what the value is, if you follow the same process you're going to get that. So I'm using this small length because the fold of paper I have available is just not long enough for a longer length. So length of 5 inches, waist circumference of 20 inches. So before you cut your flare, you need to fold your fabric. What will determine the length of fabric you put on fold is the value of the radius plus the length of the skirt. So you need to first calculate the radius, then add it to the length, and then maybe you add additional 1 or 2 inches for sewing allowance. Before you start calculating, you need to consider the place you'll be fixing the flare. Okay, for instance, if it's the waistline and you'll be adding a zip at the back, you need additional 2 inches for zip allowance. I hope that's gotten. So right now let's get into making a full circle flare. So I have this paper and I said we'll be working with a waist circumference of 20 inches. So the first thing I'll be doing is to divide the waist circumference by 6.28. That I've already done and I got 3.18. Okay, so the length of fabric I'll be putting on fold has to be 3.18, which is the radius, plus 5 inches. So I'm not using zip allowance here, but I've explained to you already, if you are making use of zip allowance, you need to add it to the width of the waistline before calculating the radius. So I'm adding 3.18 to 5 inches, and that would determine the length of fabric I'll put on fold. So for a 360-degree flare, which is an angle at a point, you know, your circle will go round and you have a point at the center. So you need to have that point on fold here. So you need to fold 4 times so that we can have 4 quadrants. So I'll fold into 2, making sure that I have that length. So in order not, if you're using your fabric directly, you need to measure and to be sure that's the length you have, or with additional 1 or 2 inches as allowance, so that you won't waste too much fabric. And then you fold again the same length. You fold again. So that's folding twice to get this point. Okay, I hope that's gotten. Measure the length to be sure that you have 8.18, which is the value of the radius plus the length of the skirt. So I have that in essence here because it's a paper. I'm not really putting that into consideration. So I'll just put my camera down so that you can see what I'm doing on the table. So here I have my paper on fold, and I'll just measure out the radius from this point. Okay, that's the center of the fold. I folded twice, so I have 4 quadrants for my full circle here. So I'll measure. I had 3.18, which is about here. Okay, so I have these lines which I'll connect. So from here I can then measure the length of the skirt, which I said is 5 inches. So I'll keep shifting from here now, measuring 5 inches down. So I'll just mark and connect. You can make use of your curve, but I prefer to dot as many places as possible, then mark out directly. I'll cut out this part to open up the inner circle that will be attached to the waist. So if it's a wrist skirt, you need to consider the sewing allowance above and also below. So, but let me do that for here. So let's assume I'm adding ½ inch allowance. This is what I would do. If I was adding ½ inch allowance at the top too, this is what I would do. So let me just do that so that you can get it once and for all. Okay, so this is the cut you will have. Well, let me leave out the allowances. Okay, so here I have my full circle. You can see it's circular, it's rounded, and that's what a full circle is. Okay, so now the next thing I'll be doing is to cut out a half circle flare. So for a half circle flare, it is not circular, so you don't need a point. What you need is a straight edge, because it is an angle on a straight line. That's the 180-degree flare, half of a circle. That's the 180 degrees is the angle on a straight line, so you need a straight edge like this. So that means putting your fabric on fold once. So once again, you have to calculate the radius, and I said for this type of flare you divide the waist circumference by 3.14, and to give you what you got for the 360-degree flare, multiply by 2. So when I divided 20 by 3.14, I got 6.34. So what will determine the weight of the fabric I will fold or paper is that radius plus the length of the skirt. So here I have 6.34 plus the radius 5 inches, and that will give us 11.34. So when folding your fabric, you have to make sure. So I have that in excess here. So if you want to manage your fabric, you can fold exactly that with additional 1 or 2 inches for the sewing allowance. So but I will leave mine at this point. So you don't need to fold again, for this is where we're going to be marking out. Like I said, it's an angle on a straight line, but you can fold like this. It's still going to be the same thing, okay? But you don't need to fold at a point. I hope you understand that. So you can fold like this, as long as you are making reference to this point here. Okay, but let me just open this up and do this. So I'm marking 6.34 all round. So now I can connect my dots together. So now I'll measure the length of the skirt, 5 inches. 5. Now I can connect my dots and we'll cut it out. I'll cut out the inner circle. Remember, I'm cutting without allowance. If you were to cut with allowance, remember to add that. Okay, so now I have this as my half circle flare. You can see it is just half of a circle. So let's compare it to what we had for the full circle. So this is a full circle and this is a half circle. So if we are to compare the length, they'll still give you that same waist circumference, that same length of skirt, but then the degree of fullness will be different because the full circle flare will be fuller than a half circle flare, and so on and so forth. It's the same circumference, the same waist circumference, but then the degree of fullness you get from this is different from what you get from this. So that's what makes them different. So a 720-degree flare is just two circles. That's two circular flares. So it will give more fullness than a full circle flare. That's one circle. So how do you achieve a 720-degree flare? You have to divide the waist circumference into two. So you make a full circle for the front and another full circle for the back, with still the waist circumference of 20 inches. What I will do here is to divide 20 inches by 2. That means I'll make two 360-degree flare using 10 inches as the circumference. I hope you understand that. But in doing that, for the front, I will need at least half an inch on both sides, right, to join it to the back flare. So instead of making use of 10 inches, I'll add additional 1 inch. So the circumference I'll be using for the front will be 11 inches. Meanwhile, for the back, we still have half of the real waist circumference. So we'll be making use of 10 inches, but then we'll have to add additional 1 inch so that you can sew in allowance, so you can connect it to the front. And again, with zip allowance, additional 2 inches. But then I won't be adding this in this case. That's because I didn't consider that when I was cutting the 360-degree flare, and I want to be able to compare the circumferences together. So I'll be using a pin to hold the front and the back, and then we'll compare the circumference together, and you see the degree of waviness and how it differs from the 360 and from the 180-degree flare. So then that means I'm not making use of this extra 2 inches for zip allowance. So we're just going to be adding 10 inches to 1 inch sewing allowance, with which we'll be connecting it to the front. So we're making use of 11 inches. So we need 2 full circle flares with 11 inches as the circumference. So for the 720-degree flare, I have the radius being 1.75. That's 11 divided by 6.28, and that's 1.75. So for each of the circle, I need to fold 1.75 plus the length of the skirt, which is 5 inches. So I need to fold in 6.75. So that way you won't waste your fabric or your paper. You'll be folding exactly the length. So the radius for this flare is 1.75. I got that by dividing 11 inches by 6.28. So I need to have 6.75. That's 1.75 plus 5 inches, which is the length of the skirt. So I need to have 6.75 and probably an additional 1 inch folded in. So I'll fold the same again because you're making a full circle flare. So now I'll mark out the 1.75 all around. Okay, so I can connect this dot, and from here I'll mark out the length of the skirt, 5 inches. Okay, so now I'll be cutting the inner circle out and cutting the hem of the skirt here. Okay, so because this is for just the front, you need to split here open, and this way you'll be connecting to the back. So you need 2 of these, going by the calculation we initially did. So I'll just fold this part of my paper again so I can make another one. But then because the back won't have zip allowance, it will be exactly like this again. So I'll just use this to cut out the second one without calculating again 11 inches. So I have 2 of this, and I'll split here open as well. So we remember the 1 inch allowance we added. So I need to connect this. I'll probably pin this down or tape it down, and I'll come show you guys what we have. So here is what we have here. You can see it's already wavy, even with just the paper without any fortification. So we have the same length of waistline here as you have with the 180-degree flare. So you can see how wavy it looks already, and the degree of fullness is way more than we had with a 360-degree flare and a 180-degree flare. So that's just the difference. With the same waist circumference, you are getting different degree of fullness. For a 140-degree flare, you have 4 full cycle. Yes, 360 times 4. So you have to divide the waist circumference into 4, and for each of the ones you'll be attaching together, you have to add additional 1 inch seam allowance to each of the division you just made. And also remember a zip allowance for those going to the back, the outfit you're making with it. So that's basically how these multiple degrees of flares are gotten and how you can go about creating. We'll be proceeding to making a 440-degree flare. I would strongly advise you stop here. Don't go any further, okay? Okay, so a 440-degree flare, that's 360 multiplied by 4, and that's a 4-circle flare. So we need a circle for each quadrant of the body, like you need 4 circles. So you're going to be dividing the waist circumference into 4 and making a full circle for each of the quadrant. Okay, so for the measurement of 20 inches we have now, we'll be dividing it into 4, and that will give us 5 inches, right? So remember the 1 inch sewing allowance, you need to connect it to the next flare. So that's with an additional 1 inch. So we'll be making use of 6 inches. Okay, for the back piece, you're going to add half an inch to connect it to 1 at the front, then 1 inch zip allowance. So that's extra 1.5 inches. So for the 2 flares we'll be having at the back, it will be 5 inches plus 1.5 inches, and that will be 6.5 for those going towards the back. But once again, remember, I'm just demonstrating and I'm not attaching zip, so I'll just make use of 6 inches for all the quadrants. Okay, but note this if you're putting a zip allowance. So I have gotten my radius, which is 6 inches divided by 6.28, and I got 0.95, so less than 1 inch. So I'll be adding that to this, to the 5 inches. That's the length of the skirt. I need 5.09, and don't forget your sewing allowance. So I'll just fold this. As long as I don't have a deficit here, I'm fine. So I'll be marking out that small 0.95, 0.96 rather. So we have this. I'll mark out the radius, and then I'll mark out 5 inches, which is the length of the skirt. So I'll cut out the radius and eventually the skirt. Okay, so we have 1 inch here. So because I'm making use of 4 of these, I want to cut out additional quadrant. I want to cut out for the 4 quadrants, and that will mean cutting out another 3 of this. So I don't need to measure all over again. I'll just place this on my paper and cut it out. And please note that I actually like cutting out my flare directly on fabric. I just feel there's no need for that wastage. So when I'm doing this, I like to just cut directly on fabric. This is just for demonstration purpose. You don't need to draft a pattern for this. So now I have 4 little cycles here, which I'll be connecting together. I'll just tape all the sides together so you can see how wavy it is. So that you can see how wavy it is. Ladies and gents, here is our 1440 degree flare. You can see how wavy it is. I can't even get it to behave properly because it's just a boss of its own. So, but then you have the same waist circumference. You have the same waist circumference, but then this is the 720 degree flare, so different degree of fullness for the same circumference. I hope this sorts out every issue you may have with flares once and for all, because that's the aim of this video, to give you a one-stop clarification where you just get all that you need to know about the flare. So, and this is it. You can see the difference it makes. Let me know if this video has been helpful. Please give it a thumbs up and put a comment down below. And if you would like to see a tutorial where we actually sew one of the degrees of flare and fortify it to give it that waviness you see in some outfits, let me know in the comment section. So thank you very much for watching. You have done so well to have watched this far. It's been a long one. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Don't miss any of the upcoming tutorial. When you subscribe, make sure you click on the notification bell so that you'll be notified every time a new video drops. So thank you and bye for now.